The brilliant Jonathan Turley is my guest today. Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time to join me. I'm so curious about so many things that are going on within the legal arguments surrounding former President Trump, and I will get to those in a moment. But first off, I wanted to just ask you, I think that Fox viewers are very familiar with your voice and with your perspective on things, but they may not know as much about your own background. So I wanted to sort of get what is the point where someone like you is able to survive and thrive in the vaunted halls of academia where views like your own, contrarian views in particular, seem to have attracted so much fire in recent years?
Well, Ben, thank you very much for having me. I do get that question a lot because it's becoming a lot lonelier in academia. I never really thought when I started teaching over 3 decades ago that we would ever get to this point in higher education. The level of intolerance and a lack of diversity of viewpoints on our campuses is something I never imagined would happen, quite frankly. I'm quite confident that I would not get an academic position today if I were not tenured. I probably wouldn't be able to retain the one I had if I wasn't tenured. And it's alarming. I wrote a long academic piece on this for one of the Harvard journals a couple years ago. Many universities have largely purged their faculty of not just conservatives and libertarians, but dissenting voices. It is now an academic echo chamber, and it hasn't diminished, even with the criticism of this intolerance on our campuses. Faculties are continuing that pattern. They are now largely composed of faculty from the left to the far left, and they view that as diversity.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one of the things that is so stunning about this, just by the fact that there was this debate going on over the past week to 2 weeks about the definition of wokeness, it prompted me to go back and watch the 2016 video with Nicholas Christakis and the whole scene around him. You know, the students, really screaming at him at certain points, but essentially demanding an apology over an email that his wife had sent about Halloween costumes. That's 7 years ago now. It seems like to me this whole thing went from being something that many who are ideologically simpatico with myself were at the time saying, look, this is a campus problem. And there's always campus problems. There's always been, radicalism there. But it feels like that was something that was really exported into being a concern for Americans outside of the academy. People not in your position and people lacking the protection of tenure in their jobs. I'm curious as to your perspective on that world. Basically, what was the thing that came out of this academic cohort over the past, decade plus that has now gone into the HR departments, gone into the corporate sphere? What do people need to know about that and how to navigate that world?
Yeah, I'm actually finishing a book right now in part on this subject because it is a surprise to me that we have severed what I consider to be really unbreakable bonds, particularly in academia, towards free speech and academic freedom. And part of it is a sort of an anti-free speech movement that has swept over the country, but it started on our campuses. And many of these academics have been successful in treating speech as harm. And so their argument is that speech is harmful, even without overt acts. And this really plays into this whole notion that there are toxic ideas out there and that they harm people. And once you define them as harmful, it then opens up a whole bunch of avenues for you to silence speech. And what is really disturbing is that faculty have either supported that or have remained silent. I've never seen the level of fear and intimidation that I do today among faculty. I run a fairly large legal blog, and it is one of the more popular sources for academics. So they send me a lot of these incidents. It's hard for me to keep up with them, but they send these to me anonymously. Many of these are senior faculty, tenured faculty. They want me to put it on the blog. They want the world to know, but they don't raise it themselves. And the reason is that this mob has become very efficient at chilling and silencing people. What they do with academics is they take away everything that fulfills an intellectual life, everything that brought some of us into higher education. So if you get tagged, if you get targeted, you're basically blacklisted from conferences, publications, even committees, even panels in your own school. All of that is gone. And faculty just don't want to risk that. A lot of these senior faculty are in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, and they want to have a fulfilling career in the years that remain. So they remain quiet. They remain silent. And the result is that the surveys are actually quite consistent. There have been about a dozen surveys at different schools across the country, including national surveys, showing that a majority of faculty self-censor and are afraid to speak openly. Now, the key about that is that most of the faculty are liberal today. So even though a lot of conservatives and dissenters have been removed from faculties, the faculty that remains, the faculty that's actually allowed that to happen, themselves privately admit that they're afraid to say anything in class. And that feeling is even worse for students. And I confront faculty all the time with this across the country when I speak, saying, what have we become? We have surveys showing that our students are afraid, that a majority of our students are afraid to speak in class. That's an indictment of the entire academy. And yet, when you raise this directly in faculty meetings or with colleagues, they just shrug. And they just say, well, there's nothing I can do about it.
What does the restoration of a small L liberal higher academic experience in America look like? How do we get that? Because to me, having come up kind of when I did, I feel like I'm one of the last people to have gone through a college experience and kind of enjoyed that in the early 2000s. And it seems like it's only become more and more illiberal ever since. And I feel like there was value to that. There was a lot of value to that. There were really good things that came out of that, I think, personally. But now I just don't know whether we'll be able to get back to it or not.
Well, Ben, I feel sorry for people going to college today. I honestly do. I have 4 kids in higher education now. One's about to head to college. And I'm really sad about what they're going to find. When I went to the University of Chicago, I was thrilled by the diversity of opinions. I had never sat down with a Republican. I grew up in a very liberal political family in Chicago. I never actually sat down, I don't think, with a Republican, certainly not one my age. I might have talked to a couple of my parents' friends. I knew they existed. I just had never really spoken to one. But suddenly I found myself surrounded by Republicans, Trotskyites, socialists. It was just an amazing experience, and I loved every minute of it. I really wanted to hear different views. Even though I didn't agree with them, I want to know why people thought that way. You just don't have that. Our campuses have become academic echo chambers, and that's what we now sell as higher education. I've been saying publicly that our last line of defense for free speech in higher education may be state universities. It's going to be very hard to regain a lot of ground in private universities. You saw that sort of with Stanford. Even in the most outrageous, disgraceful canceling of a federal judge, The dean issued a letter that was great. It supported free speech, but it lacked one thing. She refused to hold the students accountable. Mm-hmm. So these students knew what the policy was. They went in and they disrupted the event. And there will be no consequences. Instead, she's ordered mandatory free speech training for everyone, including the victims. Well, that's not the solution. But our state universities and colleges hold the greatest hope for free speech because they are subject to the First Amendment. The court system can help us protect free speech. And we might be able to build around that, this notion that if people want diversity of opinions, if they want to actually be able to hear opposing views, they might have to just focus on state universities.
Mm-hmm. Let's shift. Excuse me. Let's shift to the conversation that's obviously dominating the news cycle. Has been the focus really of the past week, and obviously it's something that you've weighed in on in a number of different capacities. I am curious as to your perception of a couple of different questions. One, do you believe that the president is actually the former president Donald Trump is going to be arrested as a result of this case in New York? Do you believe that that's an overstepping of the bounds? I mean, no former president has experienced anything like this. And do you believe that it is a legally tenable position for the New York prosecutor Alvin Bragg to actually occupy?
Well, let me take that in reverse order because the last question says something about the earlier questions, and that is, I believe that this is unabashedly a political prosecution. I don't feel that way about Mar-a-Lago. There are some potentially valid criminal things to investigate there. We can talk about whether they warrant a charge, but those are conventional, allegations. The Department of Justice loves obstruction of justice and false statements as crimes. What Alvin Bragg is doing is unadulterated political prosecution. He has given Trump a case positive for his long claim that the criminal justice system is being weaponized against him. In this case, it is. I mean, the reason I say that is because I think this may be unprecedented, this bootstrapping of a misdemeanor under this particular law to effectively litigate a federal claim. That's the only way most of us can see a chance to even prosecute the case, because the misdemeanor under the New York law has a statute of limitations of only 2 years. That ran, obviously, a long time ago. The only way you can get it above a misdemeanor and be able to try it as within the statute of limitations is to hook it into a felony. Well, there isn't any felony except the one, unless he has some surprise for us, except the federal election felony. But that's a felony that the Department of Justice declined to bring for good reason. It's a very difficult criminal case to make. And in this case, I think it'll be even more difficult than failed cases like the John Edwards case, where the Department of Justice tried this. But putting aside the lack of legal merit, there's also the way this case developed. The Department of Justice declined to prosecute the federal side of this. Even Bragg's predecessor did not move forward on this. Bragg himself threw a flag on this, and then two of his prosecutors resigned, and they conducted a public campaign against Bragg. One of them did something that I think is unbelievably unprofessional and improper. This former prosecutor used the investigation, which was still ongoing, to write a book about an individual who hadn't been charged, let alone someone who was actually still in an investigation by his former office. Bragg himself correctly said, "What the heck are you doing? Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't do this." But he was heralded by the media. They lionized by many lawyers for doing something that is breathtakingly improper. And it worked. I mean, Bragg caved to the pressure. So will he be indicted? It's hard to say because the politics is changing. This is a political prosecution. It was pushed by the politics of the moment. And in some ways, Bragg, I think, was counting on that even if the case failed, he would be credited for trying. I mean, after all, any prosecutor can bring a viable criminal case. It takes a really dedicated, true believer to bring one that's invalid. So many people would have applauded him for the effort. But now a lot of Democrats are actually criticizing the case, but particularly objecting that it's helping Trump. And that may have given Bragg pause because Trump is going up in the polls, Biden is going down. And it's becoming very clear that a lot of Democrats are telling Bragg, what are you doing? I mean, you're undermining our chances for 2024.
I think that the politics of this are so unpredictable. Just the politics of Mar-a-Lago were unpredictable too. At the time, I thought that it would both coalesce Donald Trump's support, but that it would be potentially negative for Republicans in the midterms because it would return the focus to him in a way when they had obviously been leaning into inflation and leading into border issues and the like as being the priority to take to the American people, and instead it became more of an election about Trump and particularly about his claims regarding 2020. I'm not sure that it totally matches up with that. That you can debate it looking backwards. Do you have a particular crystal ball to predict how this matter would play going forward, assuming that Bragg, at the end of the day, is boxed in too much and really does have to proceed with this, even if Democrats are in his ear saying, doing this helps Trump?
Well, I think it's going to get pretty wicked pretty fast. I think that the prosecution is likely to extend beyond the election. So this election could end up becoming, and I think Trump would invite this, a referendum on this and other cases. I've said for years that I believe a president can self-pardon. And I've written in a couple of columns that this coming election could become one over self-pardons. Both Biden and Trump face potential criminal charges. The Department of Justice has long said it will not charge a sitting president. But if they charge Trump before the election, the public may decide to sort of defy the establishment and the media by electing him, knowing that he'll self-pardon. It's going to create an unpredictable factor here. Trump was elected in 2016 as an anti-establishment figure. He was elected on far less than what he has today. The fact that Bragg is trying to indict him on this really does fulfill that narrative. It's like the old joke of the doctor telling the patient, you're really not paranoid, people really are out to get you. Well, here he's been saying they're weaponizing the criminal justice system, and then Bragg does that. Mm-hmm. So it could end up sucking the oxygen out of the room of the election. It also could make it very difficult for people to run against him. I think that's one of the reasons I think that in some ways Trump seems to be goading Bragg. I've been critical of some of his postings, which I think are really are unnecessarily inflammatory. I think that we have to be very careful about images like baseball bats next to the head of Bragg and stuff like that. But I almost suspect that he's goading Bragg, that this, of the three torpedoes in the water, New York, Atlanta, and the Mar-a-Lago business, this is the one Trump was hoping would hit first. I mean, because it's a dud. Mm-hmm. And I think that in many ways maybe these rather inflammatory postings might be an effort to make sure Bragg does go through with it.
One question, just because it was something that obviously Joe Rogan raised it, but people had been saying it online for quite some time in the lead up to this.
Wait, this is not the Joe Rogan show? I thought this.
No, we haven't. I haven't had Jamie pull anything up yet. But let me ask. He brought up the point that isn't this something that politicians have been doing for a very long time? Meaning that politicians or political allies of politicians have been paying people off in certain ways over the years in a lot of different manners. My favorite example of this, by the way, is when the Republican operators in Ohio, back when Warren Harding was running for office, sent one of his more prominent affairs and her husband on a lengthy overseas tour of Asia trip, so that they would be out of town when the journalists came to town, so nobody could talk to her. I mean, come on, this has been happening for a long time in lots of different ways. The exact nature of trying to determine whether something counts as a campaign finance issue or not, though, seems to me to be very vague and ill-defined. Is that something where there's a need for more clarity, or is it a situation where basically, there's so much that's a gray area here, it's really hard to pin down what is a campaign donation and what is not?
Yeah, Ben, I think it's the latter. I mean, I was critical of this theory when the Department of Justice was looking at it years ago and wrote about the John Edwards case. The Edwards case, in many ways, was stronger than the Trump case. There you had an affair, it produced a child, you had a campaign operative and campaign donors paying the money. It was a tighter narrative in that sense, and it failed. The reason is that you have to show that the campaign the election was the sole purpose of spending this money. Well, when you have a celebrity or high-profile person who's married, there are lots of obvious reasons why you want to hush up an affair. In this case, Trump has even more reason, right? Because he was the host of a leading reality show. He was obviously one of the biggest names in the country. He was someone who would stay in television. And by the way, television contracts have provisions that negate your contract if you bring a disrepute upon the parent company. So there's lots of reasons why he would have or his associates paid this money. I don't think you could possibly make out this claim beyond a reasonable doubt, which is why the Department of Justice didn't pursue it.
I think, I know this is a silly thing to say, but I think you could make a much better case that the decisions by Twitter and Facebook to to censor the New York Post were a much more sizable donation in kind to a certain campaign. But I take your point. Let's go out on this. It seems to me that of the various issues, going on here, the overall one that really concerns me is that this story and those other missiles that are those other different trajectories that are going at the president, the former president, are all play into an overall narrative that I have heard from many Republican friends that basically goes, we can't trust any of these people. We can't trust law enforcement. We can't trust the courts. We can't trust judges. We can't trust the DOJ. We can't trust the FBI. We can't trust, any of the members of the deep state, essentially. And that to me is very concerning, because it's one thing to say these people are incompetent, or the CIA gets WMD wrong, or things like that, or there are mistakes that are made. You drone the wrong people, that kind of thing. That's one aspect of failure. A different aspect of failure is when these entities are viewed as having been turned against the people or the people's representatives. I don't know the path out of that. You talk about the problems of one branch of American institutions when it comes to higher ed. That seems to me a much more hopeful situation than the circumstances that American law enforcement and these entities find themselves in today. How can we actually restore faith in them going forward among so many Americans who feel like they've been weaponized against the candidates they support?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question because of the erosion that we've seen. There is a basis for distrust. I mean, you had FBI officials who were fired because of bias. You've had a number of investigations, like the Russian collusion investigation, which was hatched by the Clinton campaign. I mean, they've now admitted, they denied it earlier, but they now admit that they funded the Steele dossier, and those allegations were found to be unsustainable by the special counsel. They continue to be under investigation by a special counsel. So there's reason for people to be distrustful. You have a media that has embraced advocacy journalism and is being rather open in its bias. And then finally, you've got Congress, where Democrats are opposing even an investigation into the role of the FBI. I just testified on this, and agencies into censorship of American citizens. So they don't even want to investigate the extent to which the government engaged in that conduct. All of that's going to fuel these doubts. The way that we restore it is with transparency. I'm very hopeful that the House will, in fact, investigate the full extent of this conduct, so that there cannot be any deniability as to the role played by the government on censorship and other problems. We need that, and it looks like they are proceeding in that direction. There's going to be an accounting in the election. The establishment, particularly the media, still doesn't get it. I wrote before the 2016 election a column in USA Today when Trump had just announced. And I wrote a column saying, this guy could win. And the reason I said that is that I was actually traveling through Alaska. Now, obviously, that's a very good jurisdiction for Trump. But what I was hearing was just fascinating. It's not that they liked Trump. It's that they viewed him as in some way sort of authentically inauthentic. They sort of viewed him as, we know what we're going to get with him. That even if you think that he's sort of a television, guy who's shilling for products, you know what you're going to get from Donald Trump. And that was enough because they really were after the media and the establishment. Well, all of these years, I think, of biased reporting and what the FBI has done have perfected the case for him. That's the reason I think this is going to be a wild ride coming up to the 2024 election.
Jonathan Turley, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.